Greg Sheridan, it's great to have you today. Just talking about your latest book, Christians, the Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World. How was it going through the Gospels, reading them as a journalist?
I hadn't in my life really read the New Testament properly, a book at a time. And I tried to read it very much as what I am, which is as a professional journalist. I know that lawyers have read the New Testament and historians and so on, and they've brought to bear their professional insights. When you read the New Testament in a very straightforward way, looking for meaning and narrative and character, and you read it, I tried to read it a book at a time so that I wasn't focusing too much on the deep theological implications of every verse, but getting the whole story. And first of all, it's incredibly powerful. The accounts of Jesus' crucifixion and death are incredibly stark and immediate and visceral. They just cry out to you. They grab you. You know, the moment on the cross where Jesus, who has borne all this suffering with tremendous dignity, cries out, "I thirst." I mean, I just found that a very overwhelming moment. And the moment too where he's on the cross and he looks down at his mother and at his faithful disciple, and he says, "Woman, this is your son," and to the disciple, "This is your mother." Now, there's all kinds of theological freight to that, but just the human dimension of Jesus in extremity, concerned for his mother, asking his best friend to look after his mother. So it was enormously powerful. But I would venture to say, without being claiming too much for journalism, reading it all as a journalist does give you some little glints of insight into it. So of the four Gospels, they're all magnificent. The one I like the most is Luke, partly because Luke tells you that he's writing like a journalist. He says at the start, "Okay, I'm the Bob Woodward of the Jesus movement. I've interviewed everybody. I've read all the accounts," and then he gives you all these great scoops from early on in the story with Mary. And so, to a journalist, what you say is, "Well, Luke has got great scoops there." And what is his source? It's got to be Mary directly or indirectly. The ancient church tradition was that Peter was the source of Mark. And Mark has all these episodes which are tremendously disobliging to Peter. You know, Peter declares himself for Jesus and then goes to sleep in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus asked him to stay awake. Then he denies Jesus 3 times and he weeps bitter tears at his own weakness. And that has the ring of truth to me about it too. And if Peter was Mark's source, Peter was the boss, and he would have said to Mark, "I want you to include these episodes to show people how fallible and hopeless and weak we apostles were, and yet Jesus saved us in the end." And then, of course, the letters of Paul are just so full of irascible humanity. These are not the deep theological passages, but where he's having an argument with Peter, and then when he tells the people misleading the Galatians to go and castrate themselves, and he's spending so much time on fundraising and so on. Now, that shouldn't distract you from the profound theological insights of Paul, but there's a real human character here which any journalist can spot, and which, the final reflection for you, also I think goes to the authenticity of these documents, because if you were making them up, you wouldn't include all that stuff. That has the ring of absolute truth about it to me. Yeah. The Gospels and the letters of Paul and the other letters in the New Testament are more or less 90% or more than 90% intelligible to any ordinary reader. There are things in them which are profound and difficult and involve great mysteries, and there are paradoxes and so on. But if that's 5% or 10% or whatever, that means 90% is very straightforward. You know, Jesus is sometimes needs some interpretation, but most of the time he's very clear. Love your enemies and love each other as I have loved you. And so this is not that ambiguous, you know. So before you get into the critics and the scholars, and of course you want a good translation, but you read the books, the Gospels first, and they're not that long. Neither the Gospels nor the letters. You're not going to die of old age while you read them, you know, and no. it's very accessible. Yeah. I don't think most people come to faith or even renew their faith through intellectual reasoning, although it's important to show that there's no bar in intellectual reasoning to belief. But the center of Christianity is the person of Jesus Christ. And in the end, Christianity is a relationship with Jesus Christ. All the way through the gospel, Jesus keeps saying, who am I? Who do you think that I am? Who do you say that I am?
The subtitle, The Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World, was interesting to me. And as you unpack the cultural moment that we're in and the popular culture that we imbibe, it would seem your fear or your concern is that people assume the world will stay fairly sedate in the Western world without Jesus, when really so much of what we have is foundational upon the Christian framework. And you can sort of feel like people could assume that the fruit of the Jesus story will remain even if we chop off the roots.
Yes, and I think that is a common assumption, and it's mistaken. So I'm not arguing for the past. The past was a foreign country and it had plenty of villains and plenty of catastrophes. But you do want to understand the dynamics that are at work in society today. For a long time, so the God is Dead movement has been going for a few hundred years. But for a very long time, a society will live off the moral capital of Christianity. And you can plot this in very technical ways. The categories with which the first sort of high-profile atheist detractors of Christianity attacked Christianity were all Christian categories. So there was an assumption of a moral order, of an objective good and evil, of the proneness to wickedness in human beings, but also the call to call to higher things. And for a long time, society continues to use those categories. But eventually, if you absolutely cut off those categories from their roots, there's nothing given in those categories. There's nothing given about universal human rights. I don't want to demonise him at all. He's a very fine man, but I was on a panel with Peter Singer, the atheist philosopher, on Q&A, and I was challenging him about his view in one of his books that handicapped children whose parents don't want them should be just left to die. And he said to me, but Greg, surely you don't think that simply because they're members of our species, we should keep them alive? And I said, yes, Peter, that is exactly what I think. Simply because they are human beings, they have human dignity. Now, that view that human beings have an essential and ineradicable and intrinsic human dignity, that emerges out of the Jewish and Christian traditions. And if you wipe those traditions out, eventually you don't get a kumbaya, sweet consensus. You get a very ugly contest of power. I do think society's in trouble if it wipes out its Christian roots.
You start off with saying, has God died? And your last line, Christ is risen.
It seems to me the crucifixion is even more radical than the resurrection. I mean, anybody who believes in God will believe that God can conquer death. And non-Christian traditions have had the idea of God or gods walking on the earth. It's not like Jesus, Krishna walked on the earth, the ancient Greek gods interacted with human beings. Now, this is always in a mythical time. It's not a historical time. It's not directly comparable with Jesus. I always think it indicates the idea that the incarnation was in our DNA. As somebody put it, humanity was expecting Jesus. We were waiting for him, But there's no other religious sensibility which I'm aware of which has the idea that the everlasting, omnipotent, omniscient, eternal God becomes man and is humiliated and defeated and tortured and killed and suffers death, physical death. That, I think, is completely unique to Christianity. And the theology of it, of course, is very profound, but just the sort of the straightforward, you don't have to be a theologian to understand it. God has humbled himself here. He's taken on our pain, and the things he says on the cross have their consoling element, but there's no doubt that he is suffering on the cross. This is not a sublime experience for him, which he rises above because of his godly status.
No.
And that, I think, is a sign of immense solidarity of Jesus with humanity. And of course, it's our salvation. But it also just strikes me as astonishingly radical. And
Yeah.
when you think about it, it's kind of, it quite bowls you over, or it did me anyway.
Humility wasn't a virtue back in the pagan days, was it? It was not seen as something to aspire to.
Well, you're absolutely right. The crucifixion was, it's astonishing for us. It was even more astonishing for the ancient world. I mean, the crucifixion was the most humiliating death you could die. It was a death reserved for slaves. Only a small minority of the crucified got proper burials as Jesus did. Some others did, certainly, but typically the bodies were just thrown into a pit. Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi death camps, says that the worst aspect of beatings, he took a number of beatings when he was in these camps, and of course the physical pain was horrible, but the worst aspect of it was the humiliation, the implied insult, the affront to his dignity as a human being. And Jesus' dignity is immensely affronted as a human being in the treatment of the crucifixion. So theologically it was tremendously important, but culturally it was absolutely the wildest idea for the ancient world, that the Lord your God, and indeed for the first few centuries, Christians didn't even use the cross. I mean, they were scared. It was used by their enemies as a sign of their humiliation. And eventually Christians got the idea, actually, Jesus intended to die on the cross. You know, this was what he intended to do.
And flipping that whole power weakness thing, that the cross is actually the power of God, as it says in Corinthians. And Bishop Robert Barron says that the biggest apologetic for our world at the moment is beauty. Is the gospel story beautiful?
It is, Steve, and I agree with Bishop Robert Barron. That's one reason that I write a lot about popular culture, because I think art and literature traditionally have led people to belief. The object of art and literature is truth and beauty. And what does Jesus lead you to but truth and beauty? I think Christianity has to be morally beautiful, and then it's great if its services can be aesthetically beautiful as well. But I find the Gospels utterly gripping, and the personality of Jesus completely compelling, and the symphony created by the first followers to be quite beautiful. And I think even people who don't believe it find it very beautiful. But of course, I think you should believe it as well.
What is it about the white-hot witness of Christianity that you think is important?
Well, one thing that struck me about the Gospels and the epistles, Steve, was the immediacy and the humanity of the characters. Another thing that struck me, though, is that Paul, in a way, stands for the modern Christian, because Paul didn't know Jesus when Jesus was conducting his earthly ministry. And yet Paul has the most intense relationship with Jesus. You know, there are passages in Paul where he says, Jesus who loved me and poured out his life for me. And Paul is an example to the modern Christian of how intense, how deep, how involved the relationship a person can have with Jesus, even if they weren't there at the early date. Scholars are God's creatures too, of course, and there's a place for them, and we benefit from their scholarship. But the witness is more important than the scholar, because if you explain Jesus, but live like a villain, it's the way you live that will have the greater credibility. So.
Yeah, well, as G.K. Chesterton said, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. So let's keep doing that.
Absolutely. That's the one aphorism of Chesterton's which I've lived up to fully in my life.
Right.
Given complete expression to.
Thanks so much. Hey, Greg, thanks so much for giving your time. Really looking forward to seeing how people engage with your book. And I think it is urgent. There's an urgent case for Jesus, but you showcase him so well. So thank you.